Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming back. I have something I need to explain. Some people have been asking me for notes. If you go to the office, not today, but tomorrow after my last meeting, and if you ask for the notes from the 11 a.m. sessions that I've been taking, they will print them out for you, and that'll be good. Do you know how to... that looks really good, a microphone that moves by itself. Do you know how to really annoy a storyteller? Well, what annoys me is when somebody will be talking about a story and they'll say, "Oh yeah, but he doesn't let the truth stand in the way of a good story." That really ticks me off. And the other one is when somebody says, "Oh yeah, he just got the gift of the gab." That's like saying Leonardo da Vinci had good paintbrushes. It is something you've got to work on. And I'll just give you an example of something that has happened today, if I find my pointer and press the correct buttons this morning. Next Sabbath, this coming Sabbath, I have to preach at Wurrunga. And I'll share the secrets with you. I'm preaching on the madman at Gadara, who ran down the hill naked and with chains on, and it was one of those occasions when the whole universe was watching. It was a head-on battle between Jesus and Satan. And when you read that story and start to study it, you realize that there is so much in it. It was a titanic battle. And so my sermon title is Jesus won, Satan nil. But I wanted to tell a story. And the story is about this man, Dr. Louis Slotin. Now, when you say you don't let the truth stand in the way of a good story, if you want a good story, you research it and research it and research it. Now, this man was a brilliant physicist, and he was part of the team that developed the atomic bomb in New Mexico. And he had a critical role, and he was only 35 years of age. And if I go in the right direction, this is the actual scene of where this incident happened. This picture was taken later when the thing had been deactivated. It looks pretty primitive. I see there's a Coke bottle there sitting in the foreground. But what he had was two half spheres of plutonium, and if they came together, a nuclear chain reaction with all the radiation that would ensue would suddenly go boom. There would be a blue light and a flash. And he was doing something. They've changed the practices a bit since then. He was doing what they call tickling the dragon's tail. And he had a screwdriver, and that was all they used. And they would put the two spheres apart because they would not become reactive. There would not be a nuclear reaction unless the two spheres were clamped tightly together. And the distance of the width of a screwdriver was all that was needed to prevent it. And so what he was doing, there were 7 other people in the room, and they were standing back a little bit, and some were standing closer. He had the screwdriver, and he was just pulling it a little bit out, and he could sense with his hand when they were getting close to a nuclear reaction. And he slipped, and he dropped the screwdriver. And for an instant, he took the full radiation of nuclear fission, and he flung himself right onto the sphere and took the full force. Now, this is a fascinating story because I want to use it in the context of my sermon. Christ took the full radiation of Satan's hatred. And this man, he died in terrible agony 9 days later. There was nothing. Within 30 seconds, he was vomiting outside the door. He managed to shove the screwdriver back in again, but the damage was done. Nobody else died in that room. He was the only one. Now, he was buried in his hometown, which was Winnipeg in Canada, and I wanted a picture of his grave. And I couldn't get one on the internet, and I remembered in the early hours of this morning that one of my ex-staff members lives in Winnipeg, Jodine Azzopardi. She was Jodine Stewart. And this is the beauty of the electronic age. I texted her, and I got on the internet to the cemetery where I knew he was buried, and I got the name of the superintendent of the cemetery, and I said in the message, Jodine, can you slip out? It's only 15 minutes from your house, because I measured the distance on Google Maps, and take a photo. And here I am in the comfort of the campground. Oh, that's a oxymoron, isn't it? Good old Jodine, she rushes out, finds the cemetery. I gave her the plot number, and she finds it. Dr. Louis Slotin entered eternal rest, March 23. To May 30, 1946. But, the date that they've given is the Jewish date. That's what slowed me up. He was only 35. And so she took a picture of the footstone rest, and then the inscription, and then the family tomb, and she was feeling very victorious, so she gave me the old thumbs up. Now, that makes the story more interesting for you, certainly makes it more interesting for me because of the absolute recency of it. You can see the shadows are getting longer there. It is about 8 hours after here, so it was in the evening when she went to do that. And that makes a story more powerful. So be careful when you say to somebody, oh, he or she doesn't let the truth of the story, the truth get in the way of a good story. There is a lot of research. And what a marvelous age that we live in. And furthermore, she will be watching me live. Yeah, I won't be dead. She'll be watching me live on Friday night, her time, live streaming from Wahroonga Church on Sabbath. And don't tell her, please, but that photo's going up as well. Now, what do the experts say about telling stories? I've got I went looking and sort of compiled a few, and they got some pictures, and you know, some of them are bad people, they got lots of dot points, but this is what the experts have to say about telling stories, and I'm just going to go quickly through these before we get on to our story this morning. Think before you speak. Not just a list of facts, but should contain characters, intrigue, and a definite purpose. So when you tell a story, involve the characters in your story. Just don't say you're talking about Dr. Louis Slotin, who is a physicist. I will give a little bit more detail about his background and how he was so smart that he was taken into the atomic program, and he was a Russian immigrant. And the intrigue, the bit about tickling the dragon's tail, all adds to the story. You just don't say, well, he accidentally set off a chain reaction. You've got to do that research. And it must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Sometimes we get so excited with telling stories, and we know it because we've told that story so many times, that we start halfway through. and sometimes we forget the punchline. Consider your audience. The success of a story is dependent not just on the storyteller and the audience. And I have a responsibility to have you in a mode where you can listen to a story. If you are tense, if I have really stirred you up, if I have offended somebody, I have lost that person, not just for the length of the story, but probably forever. Don't embarrass anybody because it might get a laugh, but it will also damage a person. And I tell you what, I've been guilty of that, and I have pursued people after 20 years to apologize. And it raised a great laugh at the time, and then I saw that person sitting there, and they were smiling, but I could tell that the smile was pasted onto their face. They were hurt. So don't tell a story that is going to... Look, it might have a wonderful punchline, but that person is a soul to be saved, and that is the purpose of our telling stories. Certain stories are for certain people. I'm telling adults a story here. If I had a bunch of 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds, I would be going quite differently, but I would not use baby words. Now, boys and girls, I want to tell... Who talks to their kids like that? You talk to your kids from when they can first hear you. You just talk normally. They understand that. Take the environment into account. Outside noises. Screaming children, big tent. You ever been speaking in a big tent at camp when it starts to rain and you get a real downpour? Oh, that reminds me. Better turn my mobile phone off. I just got it. Mobile phones are a modern day plague. And I can tell that none of my fellow education directors are not here this morning, because I know they would do to me what I used to do to them, and that was to ring them up. Often it happens to me, so thank you for not ringing me up. Enunciate. Sounds like a holy order. Always speak slowly, loudly, and clearly. And I think I mentioned this before. Hold off laughing at your own story. You've lost it when you crack up laughing at your own story. If you're going to tell it all. Events in your story that are important or amusing will not seem so unless they are given the proper background and explanation. You've got to give the setting. I just can't say a man called Louis Slotin was in a nuclear reactor one day. I've got to say that he was picked and chosen. He was sent to New Mexico. He was there. There were 7 people in the room. I'm painting a picture that's in my brain, and I've got to put that in your brain. The best storytellers live very ordinary lives. At the same time, don't wander off the track. I'm related to people who wander off the track. They'll start telling a story and involve Auntie Mary, and then they'll tell about Auntie Mary's cooking, and then they'll go on to Uncle Albert, and they'll get distracted. And after a while, you're saying, where's this story taking me? Your listeners need to be with you, and they need to know this guy or this lady is so clear in their story. I don't know how it's going to finish, but I know it will finish, and I'll appreciate the story. But if you go globetrotting, they wouldn't have a clue. Cook the story. Well, here we go. A good story is like a good stew. Poor stories will just present it in raw form. Throw in some meat. For the sake of sanitarium and the distinguished company we've got here, I added nutmeg. So the meat is, how did you feel? Your inner thoughts, colourful descriptions, analogies, etc. Forgive me for quoting stories that I told yesterday, because it's your personal story. The moment I had my 2 daughters call out my name, and I was coming out of a coma after 5 weeks, and I thought I was in my coffin. I thought I was being buried alive. That is cooking the story. That is putting in the essentials that you can identify with, because there is not a single person here who would like to come out of a coma and to suddenly think you are in your own coffin. It was terrifying. But that's what happens. Chunky is better. Oh, here's the old blah, blah, blah bit again. I didn't put that in. Somebody else did. Great stories are not drawn out. It is the pauses when you are coming to a really dramatic spot. In the story of Louis Slotin, he's got the screwdriver. He is tickling the dragon's tail, and he is getting it closer and closer, and at that moment, he drops the screwdriver. I can pause for about 5 seconds. And what is happening in that 5 seconds? You are building the story in your own mind. You are thinking, wow, that must have been terrible. He knows, and at that moment then I say, well, he threw himself on top of it. A pause is so effective. When I was doing my study research, I filled 150 90-minute tapes with interviews. And someone could have been paid to type it all up, but I typed every single word myself. And it took me months, because it wasn't what people were saying, it was the pause. It was a drawing in of the breath. It was a facial expression, and nobody could have done that for me, so I had to put in pause or face looks thoughtful, and it became the extremely valuable resource to me. I also learned how to touch type. Digestible chunks are much more palatable. So in a story, you are going, here's a chunk, pause, here's another chunk, pause. That's the way we remember. We don't remember in a straight line. We remember in chunks, and then we join them together. Paint the scene. Too much detail can bore. Too little detail can bore. Consider carefully what you will include. I went to the airport this morning. I really did. I had to pick some people up, and I was really worried I wasn't going to get back here, I'll tell you. But I went to the airport, okay? So what? I went to the airport. You wouldn't believe the traffic going in across that bridge. It was terrible. I've added a bit more, all right? I went to the airport this morning, and there was traffic everywhere. Most of the time, I was sitting still in the car. A bit more. Now I'm going to overdo it. I went to the airport this morning. Oh, there was traffic everywhere. A lot of the time I was sitting there, there was a lady in the car next to me, and she was using a mobile phone. Oh, I got really cranky at her. And why do people use mobile phones in the car, just like I often do? I mean, what am I doing? That's not the intent of the story. I'll go on globetrotting. So add the details that paint the picture, but don't put in too much color. And make sure your landscape, the listener can still focus on what you're trying to do. Include your reactions to the events that unfolded. Tell your audience about the emotions you might have experienced at that moment. At the same time, you'll need to learn to check your emotions, because they can get the better of you. You ever tried to tell a story up front about yourself, and you start to choke up? Does it embarrass you? It embarrasses the congregation as well. I can remember, I'm getting off the track, when I was a kid, I used to sit next to a lady whose name was Mrs. White. And she was as deaf as a post, but I loved sitting next to Mrs. White because she used to slip me lollies during the service. And this particular Sabbath, the preacher, it was the Alan White Day, and he was taking the service. And when he got to the bit where Alan White died in 1915, he all choked up, and Sister White died. I was 7. And I jumped up and I said, "No, she didn't. She's sitting next to me. And the same church, this is at Penang in Malaysia, in the last record, in the obituaries, which is always the first part we read, isn't it, in the record? They should put it on page 1. I noticed the obituary for Pastor James Wong. Anybody here know Pastor James Wong? I heard his first sermon, and he was preaching on the fruits of the Spirit. And I was 5 and bored out of my brain, and my older brother was 7 and bored out of his brain, and my father was whatever age, and he was bored. And poor old James, he became a good preacher, but he was really working his way through. He was trying to get, he studied his homiletics, and he was trying to get the congregation, and he said, "There is one more fruit of the Spirit, and it starts with P." And my father, thinking he was being very funny, just whispered to my older brother, "Pineapples." And Brian jumped up and he yelled, "Pineapples!" Oh, well, poor old James, every time he tried to get started again, somebody would start laughing. So just include your reactions, but if you get emotional, the story I told yesterday, that moment when my daughters called my name, I find it very difficult to tell that. I couldn't tell it for a few years. It's 8 years ago now. But I find when I get to an emotional part, I'm standing here. I almost have to be standing here. I become a third party telling the story about him. Because it is very easy to get choked up when you are telling a very deep personal story. But it's something you have to work on. Add dialogue. Hearing you describe what someone said is never as good as actually imitating that person or the person using real dialogue. And oral skills at imitating sounds and language, is a skill that I do not have. I am such a visual person. I've got a daughter and a brother. They can imitate Irish accents. And when I try and imitate an Irish accent, you think I'm talking in Swahili or something. It's just I do not have that talent, so I don't bother with it. If you've got it, I'm envious of you and use it. Some people have it, other people don't. I'm in that category. Establish the norm and then contrast that with how and the event didn't go as expected. A great story is about something that isn't normal and doesn't happen all the time. There must be a surprise element or a element in your story. Aim for the turning point in the story that becomes your punchline. The story of Louis Slotin, the punchline, there's 2 of them. One is where he dropped the screwdriver. And the other one was where he flung himself on top of it. Those are the 2 key elements. Those are the elements that someone will remember. Once you establish the norm of the story, describe this turning point. It's the climax of your story. Everything changes at that point as far as the audience is concerned. At that point, they understand and appreciate why you told that story. Post-commentary wrapping up. What you say after the story is through is important. Don't overcook the message and the homily at the end. You're smart enough to pick it up. If I just told the story of Jesus facing the devil and all his fury, and I tell the story of Louis Slotin and how he flung himself and took the full force, I don't have to tell you. You've got it in your head already. That moment changed my life forever, is something you can say. Avoid the Uncle Arthur syndrome. Uncle Arthur's got a lot to answer for in my case. All his stories gave me the guilt. Oh, if he hadn't done that, his pussycat wouldn't have got run over. I used to hate Uncle Arthur's stories. Be positive. Right. I'm going to tell a story, and I'm going to reveal my sources. There are a couple of books that you can get, and I'll be surprised if they don't have this up in the library. Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. He was a Roman citizen, His writing is a bit coloured because he sided with the Romans. He lived in the 1st century after Christ, and he gives an excellent commentary. It is not gospel. You do take it with a grain of salt. When you go and buy one, don't get the old version. Get a modern English one, because it's too full of these and thous and whereuntos and heretofores and all the rest. But it is quite a big book, and the Antiquities of the Jews is really worth having. So go over and get it. The Histories by Herodotus of Halicarnassus. He was a bit more balanced, and he covers a lot of historical area. And if Murray Hunter is here, he and I got onto an author who must be dead by now, because he'd be over 110, I think, if he was alive, called Ivor Powell. That's not him. There we go. And he has written a whole heap of books. They are the most valuable asset that I have. Apart from the Spirit of Prophecy, the Conflict of the Ages series is just fantastic. Remembering that Ellen White said she was the lesser light, but she just illuminates so much. It's so beautiful. But Ivor Powell, and the story that I'm using this morning comes from Bible Pinnacles, I think. It's almost like a daily devotional, and he goes through the Bible. He looks at characters, he looks at situations. He's written a book on David. He's written a book on the book of John and Matthew and Mark and Luke. He was a Welshman and an absolute born storyteller, and he had the ability to just get these little stories, strange little stories. And I'd like you to think that it was my natural brilliance that searches the scriptures and finds these things. Well, I have to tell you the truth. I've got a lot of ideas from other people, and then you can adapt them as yourself. Now, I see my friend Kevin Rappel there. Can you just put your hand up, Kevin? Good. I was looking for a volunteer and you put your hand up. Could you come out here, please? He was playing with his iPhone, by the way. I've known Kevin for many years. We're having lunch together. Have a seat. I'm going to use you. I will guarantee that long after we've finished this little story from the Bible, that most of you will have never heard before, unless you're from Toowoomba, and I might have used it up there. It's the strangest little story. But long after you've forgotten it, Kevin's going to remember it. It involved a man who was a prophet. And the story is a combination of scripture and Josephus. And also the writings of the Jewish scholars. All right, so that's just a bit of time out to give you the background. This man was called Menahem, and he was a prophet. And God used him. He was obviously a minor prophet. But he was walking down the road one day. And God spoke to him and said, Menahem, see that boy over there? Up you hop. I want you to stand over there, Kevin. And you're a 7-year-old boy walking to school. So you look about as excited as a 7-year-old boy does when they're walking to school. Do not turn around and look at me. Okay, and God said to Menahem, see that kid there walking to school? I want you to go and tell him that he is going to be king one day. Let's have some time out. I see you're all avidly paying attention, because you know, and so does Kevin, that something's going to happen in this story, because he's not going to forget it. Hopefully you won't either. Go and tell that boy that he will be king one day. And so Menaham's saying, if I just go to a 7-year-old boy and say, hey kid, you're going to be king one day, he'll forget it by lunchtime. So what can I do to help him remember what I'm going to tell him? So he came up behind him. Can't you just feel the tension rising? And this is what he did. Oh, the tension's really wise. He went bang on his backside. And the kid spun around, punched my lights out. No, thank you, Kevin. Give him a clap, would you? It's not that bad, you great wuss. The boy spun around. And Menahem said, young man, one day you listen to me, you're going to be king. And he walked off. Well, you know what? That little boy never forgot. Little boys who are ambushed on their way to school don't forget something like that. And one day he became king, and the first thing he did was to call for Menahem. And he said, well, you were right. You were obviously a prophet. He said, I want to ask you a question. Will I be king for 10 years? And Menahem said, yes. Will I be king for 20 years? Menahem slowly said, yes. Will I be king for 30 years? Yes, but the first part of your reign is going to be a lot better than the last. Now, the custom in those days was if somebody had done you a favor and you were the king, you would adopt one of their children. And he would grow up in the royal household. And he said, Menahem, I want to reward you. I want to take your son, whose name is Menahem, which is a diminutive form of Menahem, and he will grow up and he will be a special companion. In fact, we will call him half-brother to one of my sons who is a prince. And that was a great honor. He could hardly refuse. And Menahem went and he grew up in that household, and it was a very wicked household. Because that young boy who was walking on his way to school, when he became king, he had a huge ego. He changed his surname to Hero, or Herod. And just in case you didn't know, he added a title, Herod the Great. And this man was so obsessed with his kingship. And this is why Menahem paused when he came to the 30-year mark, because this was the man who tried to cut that messianic line I spoke about the other day and kill Christ, because Christ had been announced as a king. He killed 3 of his own sons because he thought they were trying to become king too quickly. And the half-brother was about the most wicked of the lot. His name was Antipas. And Herod Antipas was the one who tormented and tortured and mocked and abused Jesus Christ in his own court. Menahem, as he grew up, he would have had every meal at the same table. Wherever Prince Antipas went, he would go with him. And when he became the king, or the quarter king, the tetrarch of Galilee, he would have followed him, and undoubtedly he would have been there when Christ was mocked. He would have been there at Herod's birthday party when John the Baptist was beheaded. He was witness to all of this. And I don't know what happened, but I suspect it was at the trial of Jesus. He looked at him closely. And if you don't finish a sermon like this with "Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus," you've missed the beautiful hymn that matches it. Because as he looked at that man, something happened inside him. And came the moment when he had to go to his half-brother, the king, and he had to say, "Brother, I'm leaving. Because I believe that man that you killed, Jesus Christ, is Jesus Christ God. You killed the Messiah, and I can't stay here any longer." He left. All we know is that he went to Antioch. But also, most of the disciples went to Antioch. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were there. And when you read the account of Matthew of the trial, where do you think he got all that inside knowledge of what happened in the palace as Christ was mocked? He would have had to have gotten it from a witness who had seen everything in its gory detail, and that was undoubtedly Manaen. Where does Luke get this intimate detail of what happened in Herod's palace? It would have had to have been through Manaen. He met Paul, who had been Saul, and they were in Antioch for 14 years. And this man who had been brought up, God chooses the most unlikely people. If you had to walk the streets of Jerusalem and poked your head in the window of the royal palace and seen Manaen drinking and wining and dining at that wicked table, you would have never thought that Christ had his eye on him. And every one of us, Christ has his eye on us. He has pulled people from the most amazing places and anointed them as his disciple. And you're saying to yourself, okay, but time he told us where this story comes from. It is just one verse. And it's people like Ivor Powell who started the research, and I continued it. But I don't take the credit, but it is an amazing story. Listen to this. Acts chapter 13 and verse 1. In the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, wait for this, Manaen, in brackets, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. And it's Josephus that gives you the first clue. It was Josephus that where Ivor Powell discovered it. They were worshipping the Lord and fasting, and the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. Has that settled on you that Barnabas and Paul were ordained by these four men? They knelt, they prayed, they had fasted, and they placed their hands upon them. And one of them was Manaen, called from a wicked palace, a life of decadence. And God had planned his future all the way back, just like he's done with you and with me. A little boy and a prophet, and a little boy called Manaen, his son, who was to grow up, who when he was in that courtroom was honest of heart enough to turn his eyes upon Jesus, and that brought about his salvation. And if you and I want salvation, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Let's pray. Dear Father, we are humbled by the fact that you choose strange people from strange backgrounds, and we're even more humbled that you have chosen us. And we just pray that we will continually turn our eyes upon Jesus and be saved by that, and we'll learn grace and be your humble disciples, because we ask it in your name. Amen.